anyone's used before, I don't think.
Okay. I think we're good. We're good?
We good?
We're good. Okay.
Hello, everybody out there in the interwebs and in the classroom. Welcome to our prescribed title talk number 6. I am your moderator for the evening, Mr. Henrik. I am joined by an illustrious cast of thinkers, brains, wondrous people who are here to share their thoughts and wisdom, not just with the people in this room, but those of you out across the whole world. I'll have us introduce ourselves one at a time, just to make sure everyone knows who's in the mix here. Starting at our far left.
Mr. Johnson, TOK teacher.
I'm Maria Oliveira, TOK student.
Abby Franks, also TOK student.
Ariel Whitebright, English teacher.
Wonderful. And the prescribed title that we will begin with today is this, number 6. Are we too quick to assume that the most recent evidence is inevitably the strongest? We'll be discussing this with reference to at least the natural sciences and moving on to another AOK, several of which I think fit well into this. To start us off, make sure that we're all on the same page here, Mr. J and myself, we're having a conversation before about this PT and kind of grappling with the fact that, at least in my idea, it's describing one type of investigation or thinking. Mr. J was pointing out that much of our work in natural sciences, in arts, and a variety of different AOKs is sort of cumulative. It's bit by bit. When we get new evidence, that evidence doesn't disprove or negate previous evidence, it just sort of adds on. And this PT seems to be kind of focusing away from that style of investigation to a place where the recent evidence is inevitably, again, this sort of weird statement, the strongest, right? It's somehow, and the word I think I used was supplantation, is supplanting previous evidence. It is seen as stronger than, we should value it more than previous knowledge. To give it a little bit more, I guess, weight here, I think that there's two, I guess, central areas that we can think about. The first would be what I termed, I guess, dietary science here as an example of this sort of practice. I'm sure all of us can remember, especially the teachers here, eggs historically having been not good to eat, and then about 10 years ago it was deemed good to eat, and then now again I'm uncertain, should I be having chocolate every day, every other day?
Yeah.
Does it help with my brain? Does it harm my brain? And so in this place, I think we see that the most recent study or evidence is often given sort of the strongest weight. And then the last thing I'd like to bring up, just to really sort of animate this, the idea of historical evidence somehow being tainted with the morality of the time, right? I give the examples here of the conditions in which, for example, let's say historical knowledge was gained, being influenced, being shaped by biases at the time, shaped by a lack of voices in the room, right? If the sociological or anthropological study was being produced and everyone in the room looked a certain way, came from the same sort of cultural background, should we not then take modern evidence with some extra positive weighting due to the fact that there's simply more voices and maybe questionably moral progress in the realms of, I guess, the realm of investigation. So all these things are out here. I guess we can just start with this. The idea of too quickly, is it a yes or no to start off, and then we can dive in from there. Let's start, I guess, over on this side, if that's okay.
Sure. With the idea of it being too quick, I mean, I definitely am coming at this from the lens from the arts, I feel. And I feel like sometimes it's actually the opposite. I think of, like, you know, different adaptations of classic films, right? And I feel like sometimes we are, well, I guess I'm saying that I do think we are sometimes too quick to assume the opposite with the arts, where the classic should always be the best one, and the adaptation shouldn't, right? So the most recent one is not as good. And so we are too quick with regards to time and that nature, but almost the opposite of what the prescribed term was saying.
So when I first looked at it, I said yes, but then, like, as I was thinking about it more, I said no, because like, especially I wasn't thinking about it from the arts at all.
So were you too quick to think about it?
Exactly, I think so, I honestly
My
think
first
so.
bachelor, ML.
So, like in the sciences, like somebody will do an experiment once and be like, it works, but like obviously you have to repeat it. So if it's not repeatable, then that knowledge isn't, so like then you're too quick to assume that it worked first time if it's not repeatable.
For me, the most recent knowledge, like without thinking, I would say is the most like trustable, but like because I feel like we have more tools than we had in the past years. For example, in the sciences, we have tools, or in math, for example, that is another area of knowledge. We have formulas, tools that we didn't have in that moment. But I also feel like that doesn't mean I feel like we cannot trust, for example, the internet. There's a lot of fake news, fake information. So I think now it's easier to acquire knowledge, but it doesn't have to be the strongest one. It has to have fact checks, and not only from one point of view, or what you say of the culture, different points of view.
Good, so the idea is sort of being like recent evidence on its own, maybe not the new tools we have and the sort of combination of the amount of evidence, we can kind of cross-reference. Very interesting. Cool.
Yeah, Maria makes a great point with technology, especially in the natural sciences. As technology improves and the instruments we use to study what we study seems to be a strong reason why we might kind of assume much more quickly that recent evidence is stronger. But in these other AOKs, like human sciences, which we'll probably gravitate around a lot, there's something, like Mr. Henniker was saying, there's something often non-cumulative about them. They have these cycles, they have these non-linear kind of flow to them. There's nothing intrinsically problematic about going back to a theory of psychology that we entertained a century ago. Whereas if we did that in physics, which has happened, but it's a bit more, it's much riskier. There's a lot of social pressure to not do that. There's quite momentum in the natural sciences, whereas these kind of like non-linear growth cycles seem to happen more in something like human sciences. So I guess my answer is it depends on the AOK. Yeah.
Good, I kind of like this idea. Yeah, this idea that if you were to try to say to someone, forget everything you know about physics, we got a new thing here, that would generally not work well, right? Like there is this sort of cumulative, even though the sort of big changes might be a redescription of the evidence that exists, new evidence doesn't necessarily have dramatically more weight in and of itself for its newness. Which brings us to this question I have for us, which was, when I was first reading this, I couldn't help but wonder, is there a difference between this question and something called the recency bias? Just to explain the recency bias, it's a bias that favors recent events over historic ones. It's also known as sort of memory bias. We give greater importance to recent events. For example, we have clear evidence. The final closing argument by a lawyer in a trial is generally rated as being superior, just due to it being the last and most recent one. And so there's a question here of, is this thing just saying, hey, we should watch out for recency bias? Or is there something a little bit deeper here? Is there something more meaningful? It being the IB, I think we should assume something else. But what's the difference if there is one? You can throw it to anyone.
I mean, I feel the example you give about the final lawyer decision, I feel it will, for example, when a process like that is done, is what I said about before the information. Like probably the first argument they had, maybe they didn't have as much information as they had in the end. So, but having that much of information, they can, like, depending also on the person, as I said before, but with much information, you can make a more clear decision. So I feel like that example is good, but like it's related to the amount of information they have.
I think that Marie keeps pointing us to this place, and it's worth investigating. Is the recent evidence in this valuation maybe not even having to do with the evidence itself at all, but on the sort of growth we have made, both as investigators individually and socially, right? So maybe it's the fact that we just have so much accumulation of evidence makes us better suited to evaluate new evidence than we would have been historically.
think that's interesting, like the point you brought up, but like also who says the evidence, I think is also super important, because like we were learning about this thing in history where Reagan said something about like the Star Wars, which is like the space lasers, and he said it and nobody thought to fact check it. And so like the point of like he said it, like he's the president of the United States, why would he like lie to like millions and millions of people? So like the fact that he said it, that like it's automatically true in that way.
That's fun. I like this idea of not recency. If it's a recent evidence, is being presented by people alive today, generally, right? Maybe when we go back and read historical accounting from, this was still relatively recent, like a Winston Churchill, if it's someone from our generation who has very little contact with his charisma, his personality, it may not be as impactful. Like that's just a voice speaking from the ether versus a video of Reagan saying something in current times. I mean, I keep using Neil deGrasse Tyson in these, but if he comes out and says something about astrophysics, I'm going to accept it much more than average astrophysicist because I'm familiar with them. So that's interesting, this idea of the speaker of, the finder of recent evidence.
Yeah. We haven't come to it yet, but I did want to highlight the adverb in this PTA, inevitably. Because there is, especially in the natural sciences, Neil deGrasse Tyson, there's quite a tension for students that choose this one between recency, which does kind of anchor us in the present, and inevitably, which anchors us in the distant future. So there's this real time tension, and I think if we take that seriously, along with what Maria said about technology, in an AOK like the natural sciences, I think we can feel pretty confident about that phenomenon. It's like, yes, there is recency bias and these other biases, confirmation bias too, close cousin. But if we're also fixated upon this idea that inevitably it will become the strongest, like it's recent, it's happening right now, but we're not saying it's strong until much later, or we're not feeling its strength until much later. So there's a real tension between that, that adverb. I can use parts of speech. There's an English teacher here, between the adverb and the adjective. Yeah. So yeah, I think again in something like natural sciences, I'm pretty compelled by that because there is this cumulative structure. But I'm fascinated back to what Ms. Wegbright gave us earlier about these canonical works. The original work really does carry this weight. Like, you know, all these new renditions of Shakespeare, you know, most of us in the back of our minds are like, oh, it's still not Shakespeare. It's cool, but yeah, so.
Well, I think too, this gets at the idea of just research in general, right? So like, I've been, you know, knee deep in extended essays, and I definitely, you know, encourage students to always look for the recent articles. But at the same time, because of, you know, kind of what Maria pointed out earlier, like how there is just so much more out there, how can we really boil it down to know if it's credible or if it is the strongest, right? And I do think that it goes back to that idea of credibility that Abby brought up, because when I think of credibility, I definitely want to go back to the canon. I want to go back to, well, who have they read that makes them question this or think differently than the canon? Like, do they have enough knowledge to begin with to then make a new point or have a new idea? And I feel like if they don't, then I don't necessarily think it is the strongest. And so to me, then the adjective and the adverb don't even matter, because inevitably we have to go back to the original. And like I feel like you can do that even in natural sciences with I don't know, you know, Einstein, right? Everyone's going back to, oh well, Einstein thought this, and now we do this, this, and this differently than what he did. They're still going back to that, which is obviously not the most recent, but it's the most well known.
That's even more fascinating. I wonder what the student panelists think, because correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Buckenberg, but it seems like you might be suggesting almost something like a cumulative progress in literature also.
Yeah.
It happens a little bit differently, but nonetheless, there's some kind of progression going on. And
Right.
if you don't sufficiently read and honor the past, whose shoulders you're on, yeah. And maybe it ends up being more of a social phenomenon, like people, because when it comes to the arts and literature, like the audience matters so much more than any other AOK. And that third, Mr. Barton said this in another panel, like that's the triangulation that happens in the arts. Like if you take the audience away, then we're not doing art anymore.
Right.
So yeah, there's some kind of social acceptance, respect going on, but nonetheless, there's a progression, yeah. I don't know, do you guys see progress in
Yeah, for me,
literature?
when I did the extended essay, I did it on econ, that is a human science. And I really felt like what I said before about the tools, like they are really useful tools, but I also feel like we are biased. Like I was always fact checking because extended essay is something really formal, so you have to get the strongest information. And I ended up realizing that the recent news, the recent economic things that were happening, I had to go back to the classic ones, to the basic supply and demand market to really understand what was happening now. So, yes, like as I said, we have new tools which allow us to make maybe knowledge faster, maybe more accurate, but I feel like always the classic is where we go back to, and it's like what we rely our actual knowledge on.
So you need the foundation to like continue to build on what is going on. But do you necessarily need, like in everything, do you need a foundation for it?
That's the question, I guess, right? Like, what's the strongest?
Yeah, well, like, back to where Mr. Henrik started us too, like these dietary science, nutritional science cycles. It reminds me of like ice ages, like eggs are gonna come back trending again in the 2030s.
But this happens with education too. So
Ooh,
like,
that's
again,
a nice
like
example,
more human
yeah.
sciences as well. Like we were told never to do a whole class novel when I was in school for teaching, and now it's back again. You know, so it's just who is deciding on these trends? Who's deciding what's most recent?
Yeah.
Right? But then really, if you actually know enough information or enough knowledge, you know, oh wait, this isn't recent at all. They actually did this in the 70s and it failed, but now they're trying to apply some new technique to it, which sounds new, but it's not actually, so again, I don't know. I keep going back to that kind of classic or canonical idea.
Like for me, strongest is like, now that I'm thinking, strongest for me would be like not the oldest, maybe the strongest, but also like the knowledge that has been already throughout the years, has been fact-checked, has been like seen by multiple views. So like, for example, the definition of strong is firmly held or established, which made me more think about the past than rather to the actual one. Like I feel like, I don't know, the gravity formula, for example, that is something pretty basic, has been viewed by many scientifics, has been viewed also by TOK teachers, by Ivy students from all around the world from years ago, and everybody like finally agree with that. So maybe the strongest because it doesn't like has been revised and revised throughout the years. So if there was something wrong or like didn't match with it, someone would ever realize.
Can I ask a question? But so as much as like again, I feel like I'm still formulating ideas about this, but I think too, if we always believe the most recent is the strongest, or we believe that, you know, what everyone else believes is the strongest, then how would we ever have new ideas or new thought? And with the natural sciences, I especially think that it's important that we have those new questions and those new ideas. And so if you're constantly going back to the canon, then you're just going to accept the reality with which you're given instead of, you know, finding new ideas. I don't know.
Yeah, I have to, as the token physicist on the panel.
Thank you, yes.
When you're setting me up, my favorite living physicist, Dr. Nima Arkani Ahmed, Iranian Canadian guy, And he's got lots of public talks, and he famously always talks about how, and he does theory too, theoretical physics. He's trying to come up with new ideas all the time, but he repeats this slogan about how constrained he and his colleagues are. They're like wearing this straitjacket, even though they put all of their time and energy and effort into coming up with new ideas. Like that's all they focus on. They want fresh, other BT, fresh ideas. But simultaneously, they feel themselves like super constrained by like the framework that they're already operating in, or they're trying to tweak a little bit. So yeah, that's quite a back and forth in itself. But they definitely take risks. Like this same guy, Nima, talks about, the concept of space we need to throw out. I'm like, well, okay, that's kind of fundamental physics. Yeah, good luck with that. And then the next day they're like, the concept of time we need to throw out. That also seems fundamental physics. Good luck with that. So they're not allergic to taking risks. I think they constantly play this game of like, okay, what radical new thing can we actually inject, but then keep everything else untouched? It's like, they don't just want like this sprinkling of radicality, yeah.
If I can just jump in and potentially recenter, I'm a little concerned about us veering into the space of theory and frameworks, and I understand why it's very hard to get away from them.
Yeah.
I do think the PT is focused on evidence accumulation and the supplantation, right? And I was thinking about this when you were talking about the canon and these sort of historical books. So here's the example that comes to mind of evidence in sort of the framework of interpretation in the arts. So I had a film teacher in university who was the first person to publish a critical interpretation of Clockwork Orange. And he said he had gone and seen it something 5 or 6 times in theaters, and he would be in there with a little notebook writing notes, and that it wasn't until years later when he was actually able to get the VHS that he noted a whole host of errors he made. Just because, he couldn't watch it over, he couldn't pause scenes, he couldn't do the sort of investigation that we do now, and that actually meaningfully changed some of his interpretations, right? And so that to me is sort of more central to this area of investigations. Like we have maybe a new technology, like I mentioned maybe earlier, new people in the room pointing out new things, that brings up new evidence that then we weigh against historical evidence, right? In this case, we're saying that we just assume that that's going to be stronger. I think it's important to distinguish that sort of process from the process of making theories, which seems sort of ancillary or secondary thing to judging evidence and its strength. Does that make sense, I guess, or?
Yeah, and somehow, so I think the one AOK we've yet to touch upon may well be history, and something Mr. Hendrick just said reminded me of history, which is a little disturbing. Like if we're trying to capture an event, even a kind of traumatic event that happens in history, and we let time go by, like we know it's going to be in the history books. We know this is a key event, and we've studied more, we've accumulated scholarship, and yet we have this distance from the actual trauma that was the event. And so I find this fascinating to interrogate the PT too. Like the recency here is it's no longer recent where we are in the present. It's the evidence as it happened, kind of locally close in space and time to whatever occurred. And so history, this is very tricky to think about if anyone chooses this PT and chooses to think about history, because we have to be careful about what we call recent too. Is this recent relative to the event we're studying, or recent relative to our the evidence we're producing? But yeah, I'm inclined to think that there's some truth to that. Like if there's an event, even with as sophisticated as historical scholarship is now, there's something we lose invariably, I think, the further we are in time and space from something having happened. And so I'm just throwing up my hands here. We haven't talked about history yet, and this seems very difficult to address this from the perspective of history.
So do you mean like having a first person account of something, or like the first person account being taken like right after the event, or taken like further away from, I'm
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Abby. We could think about it in terms of like primary, second evidence too. But I guess I'm thinking just more in terms of time. This PT really makes us think about time, and yeah, I think kind of being closer in time to an event that's happened. I tend to think that that's going to give us better access to capturing that. So it's interesting to think about, because we do have sophisticated methods and technology and tools in history. So we will, and on the interpretive level, like Mr. Hendricks was saying, like if we're a revisionist historian and we have this new take on a historical period, but nonetheless, we have this distance that's ever growing too. The more we study it, the further we are away from it. So it's kind of a wrench in the system there, yeah. But I don't know. No.
An example, a concrete one we can think about is one of our previous presidents, James Buchanan, who quite famously, even at the time, was very, very close to a male friend of his. In fact, they shared housing together. You can imagine a situation where, at the time, letters found between them would have been interpreted within the framework of the time.
Yeah.
And now, if we were to uncover maybe another letter or another bit of information, we might be inclined to say, no, we're definitely more accurate in this evidence is stronger because our framework has shifted, because our sort of understanding of socially taboo topics at the time has changed. I mean, I think that this kind of keeps going back to Maria's point here. Like, when technology changes, when frameworks change, and when more voices sort of are included, shouldn't we just, at sort of base value, assume that evidence uncovered is going to be sort of stronger? I think this is a real challenge. What do you think?
I mean, I definitely think that with the way, like, I guess if you take into account the socio-political context of the information that you're getting, right, of the evidence that you are receiving, then I think absolutely you have to be quick to assume that the most recent is the strongest, because we now definitely are in a society where we know more about just everything, right? Because of our communication, because of our tools. But I have to go back to the historic context as well. And also the arts, right? I can't ask Fitzgerald if he meant this by this sentence or this word. But if it was the 1920s and I thought about how this is going to be taught in American schools for years to come, then I probably would have asked him a lot more questions so that my evidence was the strongest. But I don't know. I don't think we can ever I don't know.
I think this is a really good point. For a situation like Fitzgerald, what does new evidence look like? I mean, it seems to me that it is only, new evidence for something like that only comes from technological innovations, some sort of random breakthrough of we found a bunch of letters or correspondences, right?
But also, I think of medical kind of innovation as well, right? We can now go back through Fitzgerald's work and say, we know that he, maybe was emotionally abusive to his wife, and here's the evidence from his fictional texts that show us this, right? Or same thing with, go to Sylvia Plath. You look at Sylvia Plath's work through the lens of mental health that we have now, and you're like, oh my gosh, why was she not treated, right? Or why was she treated in a certain way that wasn't conducive to actually helping her? I don't know, I guess that would be the only, just the lens through which you look at their art or their work, but
they're still considered classics.
yeah, but I guess what are you trying to, like, what's the evidence that you're trying to get out of their work, I guess?
Because like when she was explaining Fitzgerald to us, I was like, oh, I don't want to do this because this guy was super abusive. And so it's like, I don't know, like I just like as years go by, like do they get, like they're still considered classics though. Like even though we know all this information being like, and it's like hard to like read Sylvia Plath's poems because of how like graphic they are. And like we know that she should have been treating, you're like, oh, okay. So like it just puts like obviously this different lens on them. But they're still like always very prevalent like in schools and stuff. So
Right.
Does evidence, so this is an unstated assumption, does evidence collection require a theory or hypothesis? Right, like when we were talking about this, I feel like we've been kind of chatting around this, sort of like, yeah, we just acquire evidence, we excavate and it pops up. But it's sort of like, yeah, we take this new medical framework and we apply it. We have a hypothesis, so we search for evidence to support it.
Yeah.
Mr. J is excited, I
Well,
see it.
well, I mean, Mr. Henry and I were talking before, and what's super cool is there's a paradox in this PT, which we often want to try to find, and I think, like, if there is a theory / hypothesis already on the table that's been kind of gone through scientific methodology or literary methodologies, kind of the mechanism has been cranked. So there is a framework, there is a theory, there's a hypothesis, and now we're at this later stage of collecting actual evidence. Well, we almost want to answer this like, well, of course the more recent evidence is stronger because it's on top of this mountain of already accumulated evidence. We can't just ignore the evidence, the evidential pile that is being placed on top of. So if we're looking at the top of an evidential pile, it's like a good band name or something, evidential pile, yeah. Then yes, it's going to be very attractive. But then the other option seems to be, Mr. Hennick was saying, like, well, if we don't have a theory or a hypothesis, then we have like this contradictory proposal, this new framework of theory or hypothesis, which goes against prior understanding. And almost again, I would be inclined to think like, yeah, like we don't have a pile yet. So in a trivial sense, it's the strongest. So are we looking at the top of a pile? Like, well, that seems pretty strong because the rest of it's really stable because it's on the bottom of the pile. And I'm looking at it first before everything else. Or am I in this other option, option B, where it's a contradictory view and now there's no other evidence to compare it to. And so it's almost trivially the strongest and also the weakest. Yeah.
So going to this food example,
Yeah.
I feel like the food example actually avoids both of those. And the evidence, in a way, is the theory, right? Like, basically what will happen is they'll say, all right, we're gonna give everyone here chocolate in the placebo group, not chocolate, and we're gonna test. We have a bunch of theories about what's gonna happen. And we think that the people who eat chocolate 5 times a day are gonna be the healthiest. And then they get it back and it's like, ah, crap, it's the people who eat chocolate twice a day. No idea why.
Yeah.
But in a weird way, it's like, that is the evidence is the theory, like it's all in one. Basically, you throw out everything else and you go, well, my theory didn't work, but it's clearly true that we have a consequence. We can't question the consequence.
My question in response to that, though, to everyone is would that be symptomatic of an unhealthy A-OK? I said that as diplomatically as possible, but like, would we want that collapse? Would we want any discipline where just the evidence itself stands in for a whole theory? I don't know.
Well, you can imagine an AOK, sorry, I'm jumping into this, but you can imagine AOK, technology, for example. Let's say that we have 3 competing ideas about how to make a silicon chip work faster.
Okay.
And they're running tests, and one of the options that no one predicted to work at all is just simply the fastest, right? And again, sort of like evidence and result all in one, right? It's just clear that these other 3 theories are not useful in terms of understanding why this works. I don't know if that, or is that just not how it works? We just can't imagine a situation like that.
Well, yeah.
I get what you mean. But is it you being lazy? I don't know. Cause like, so for my math IA, I'm doing like soccer formations. And so I just put a random like thesis statement. Cause I was like, well, if it's not these two, then it has to be the last one. Like, right? Cause it's like process of elimination. So like, but it like, I was like, oh my god, I'm so lazy. But I'm like, it's the only way to do it. Like, I can just rent, like, I have a 33% chance of getting it correct. And if it's not these two, then it has to be the third one.
Well, you could also imagine taking that
Yeah.
and putting it into an AI generator, right?
Right.
Say for the most efficient offense, right?
Right.
Based on these player skills. And you have your theories about the 5 that are going to work the best, and then
Right.
just this one pops up that defies all previous theories, shouldn't make any sense, but you try it and it just works,
Right.
right? In that sort of situation, like that recent evidence just wins on virtue of its
Right.
what it does, like what it can accomplish.
Okay.
Mr. J doesn't like it.
Well,
a little bit.
I'm suspicious. Abby's the soccer expert on our panel, but I am, from my minimal soccer knowledge, I am well aware. Men's soccer, I'm sorry, Abby. I just remember men's soccer, like, see if I get this right. The German national team is famously quite aerial. Is that correct, Mr. Barton? They keep the ball in the air quite a bit. A lot of high.
Certainly did in the late 90s and early 2000s.
That must be what I'm remembering, Whereas the Argentinian team is more like ground-based with their passes, a lot of quick passes, stay on the ground, quick dribbling. And then you got these, like, I guess it's kind of conducive to the physiologies we're dealing with, taller German players keeping the ball in the air. But, yeah, I mean, that's the beautiful thing about sports, not only soccer, most team sports tactics we could think about here. It's the combination of them that is just utterly unpredictable. You know,
Right.
like we're never, sports will just terminate as a human ritual if we find like the ultimate tactic, you know, the end all be all of tactics. So yeah, what happened to work well, you know, the aerial style of play for the German national team, like, yeah, maybe it won them the World Cup one year, but then guess what? 4 years later, the next World Cup, the Dutch have studied it, the Koreans have studied it, everyone's studied it, so they know how to play against it, plus they have some newfangled tactic, which no one's even heard of.
I guess would that
Yeah.
not fit, right? Like, I think the example, when you think of things like Moneyball, the 3-point shot in the NBA, right? Is that you had all these antiquated theories
Yeah,
that just crumbled in front of the evidence that you play like this, it just works, right? And then now, as you said, like people are adapting, like they're basically doing more statistical stuff, where if you talk to anyone who has theories and understandings of baseball,
Yeah.
for example, you would go, what, you should not do this, and they go, well, it works.
But then I feel like we're getting into the question of like evidence versus theory, right? So like practice versus theory.
Yeah,
And so essentially saying just evidence is always going to be stronger than theory, always, right? So, but that doesn't necessarily play into the time aspect of it.
yeah.
But
And speaking of the time aspect, I know I'm a broken record now, but that adverb inevitably, I think we've lost sight of it again, and it's supremely important, because we're fixated in the present tense, but it's not just asking to the present. We have to think about the seemingly distant future too, simultaneously. So, yeah, I love that. I think that distinction is relevant here, theory versus practice. Yeah, like all these clear-cut examples where we get a nice like operational test, like, okay, yes, okay, this is the best. But what do we do with the inevitably? Like, I think we're losing sight of that.
Let me
Yeah.
put this thing out for you all to consider. Obviously, we're witnessing this with the advent and the giant growth in AI technology recently. In many ways, AI technology is a space where this notion of recency and recent evidence is basically the central way in which it works, right? Like, the notion is, this is our current best prediction, most accurate prediction, constantly searching for more, more evidence, more recent evidence. And we can imagine a world in which theory basically falls apart because these prediction machines are just more accurate, the evidence we get from them blows away our previous theories. I don't know if that's way too in the future, but that kind of points, I think, to a future where, yeah. I'm lost here. This is fun.
I think though that brings up again kind of the origin of where is the AI getting their evidence? Because I don't know, in my class we watched Coded Bias, which was all about like algorithmic injustice and how that is playing into how AI even works. And I am not a mathematician or a tech person at all, but that has to play into the newest, right, evidence as well. They are still taking from somewhere, but where?
I mean, for me, something happened really cool is when with percentage when I was with my Emma and doing it also in sports in cartwheel in the symmetry, and I used a guy and then a girl, and the guy did like had perfect symmetry. When he did the cartwheel, it was perfect symmetry, and I feel like I can be a really useful tool, but I think we're also as a society we're getting too comfortable. For me as a student, now if I need a quick, fast answer, I would rather go to ChatGPT than to try to do an investigation that takes longer. Of course, if it's a more formal thing, I will go and do the investigation. But I think we also got so comfortable that sometimes we don't even realize fact checks. But also going to evidence versus theory, like there was this girl that did the cartwheel and it completely blew out like the theory that I had about the symmetry and how we need the symmetry for the cartwheel because she wasn't symmetry, her arms weren't symmetrical. And talking with my math teacher, talking with other people that knew about this, they never could give me an answer. And I even asked IA, and he told me like I was wrong.
The AI told you were wrong?
Like there was no way possible to do this, but I had the evidence. So like I don't think IA is something trustable to rely on the evidence.
Just so we understand, Maria, so the asymmetrical cartwheel, it was better in what sense?
Like they say like if you're gonna do a perfect cartwheel, if you don't have symmetry in your arms because you form a triangle. Like you form a triangle, you do like
but
this.
I guess my question is how do we measure how good it is? Like how fast?
Like I use a program to measure the degrees of the arms, and like normally it's a 90, 180, and 90. When you do a cartwheel, you extend your arm, has to be 90, and I use people that really knew how to do it, and it was stopped by photos, but there was a girl that didn't have the symmetry of the arms and the legs, but could do it.
Did she have different length arms?
Yes, like it was like 3 centimeters more.
Sorry.
So it was like I don't know why she had 3 centimeters more. And saying of the theory that was like based on the symmetry on the cartwheels or of a documentary, so you couldn't do a cartwheel without having the perfect symmetry.
Or you just couldn't do it?
Couldn't, because I mean it has sense because if you have more arm longer than the other, you
Crash.
could not form a perfect triangle, but she could.
Right.
So I asked a lot of people, they couldn't give an answer, and talking about the IA, I asked him and he told me I was wrong, but I had the evidence that I wasn't wrong.
Right.
So like, I don't know, I feel it's a really useful tool, but I feel like society rely on now that, but I feel we shouldn't rely on that, and we should not also for the IA, artificial intelligence, but also look from some webs, some professionals.
That really brings up the question of what is recent, and what Mr. J brought up earlier. If I have ChatGPT give me the answer, and then you just did the study, and you put them both, they were both produced at the same time, which was more recent? Of course, to my mind, yours is more recent because you did something, but people are going to count that AI generation as evidence for, that's fantastic.
Yeah. And that, I'm still stuck in inevitably too. Like, is inevitably actually relative to like the recency window ending? Like just when recency ends, or is it actually like distant future? I don't know. And that might change depending on the AOK too. Yeah. 'Cause I think in natural science and mathematics, I think a lot of researchers that have been in the fields for long enough know that there's a certain trendiness to recent ideas and evidence, and they just have such a strong commitment to the truth. Like you see writers making these proclamations too, like, okay, my theory is not really being socially accepted or gaining much ground right now. But I know 200, 300 years from now, you know, it will be accepted, and they take solace in that. They're like, okay, I can live with that. Yeah, my friends don't believe me, but it's okay. That's not the essence of my field. So I think that's the inevitably that math and natural science might be thinking of. But in our other AOKs, I'm now wondering, I didn't think this before, but after what you guys have said, I'm wondering if inevitably should be more kind of like, by the end of what we call recent, it will be the strongest, as opposed to like eventually, centuries later. Because I don't think with all these fields where we have these like new theories that come up in cycles all the time, like I don't think it makes a lot of sense for us to think about the distant future.
And I guess that's one of the things with the definition I'm not sure if I'm following here. Because it says, the definition here for is certain to happen or unavoidable. I don't know if unavoidable or certain to happen needs a temporal basis, right? Couldn't it just simply be saying like, the category of recent knowledge is inevitable just due to the category to be, versus it's something that happens over time. So this is a very philosophy extension.
Yeah, I'd have to think more about that.
Okay, and so I think as we're kind of coming to the end here, I want us to just kind of end with this idea, and again, I brought it up earlier, about the sort of expansion of communities, the inclusion of more voices, right, as maybe potentially one of the grounds for taking recent evidence and being more appreciative or taking it as inevitably, right, strongest. But kind of included in this is maybe an idea of moral progress. I know this is a little outside of the bounds, but I think it is worth thinking about here. Are we assuming going into the future that maybe just to the fact that we are, again, including more voices, thinking more about our biases, that we will just be more normatively, morally virtuous humans, and that those future humans, the future TOK panelists 100 years from now, will just be better at acquiring evidence that is accurate or that is strong than we do currently? And that's a real open question, but I think it's a relevant one here. I guess we can maybe go down the line with last thoughts and then turn it to our audience. Anyone want to start?
I mean, I definitely think so, because if there's more voices in the room and as diverse as we can get it, then and we have all of these opinions here and they form like one concise opinion that like everybody's like heard and like had like a say in, then I think, and if everybody accepts that that's outside of that group, then it is a sign of moral steps.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And for me, what you say about like we're gonna turn into more virtuous humans, I think it's a little bit like depending on the point of view, because what I said before, we have a lot of tools today, but depending for which context, for which IOK is different use, and I feel some of them harm more the society. For example, not fact checking or just getting too comfortable with the information we have, just getting the first information we have, we are getting too comfortable. So I wouldn't assume that we're gonna get more virtuous. Maybe we have more tools that make us get knowledge easier, but I think we're gonna still rely on the knowledge we had before. Like I feel like it's something we're gonna do always, but like I just wanted to point, like I think we shouldn't assume that we're gonna turn more better. We're gonna turn better because like we have more tools, but that doesn't mean we're gonna get better. Like depending on the use we give in the future.
Although there's a bunch of many more lazy voices in the room. I like the idea. So
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the way that you were phrasing it feels very like humanist, right? And individualized, and I think that that's a really like idealized look at what could happen and like what should happen, hopefully, right? But I think too, it could also lead to more of like an anarchist, right? Kind of society as well, where, well, I believe this and therefore what you're saying is not okay and not right, and I'm gonna do what I want because that's what I believe. And so, I don't know, I think that ideally, we would end up in a world much more like the one that Abby described. But yeah, I don't know.
The fear now of siloed, sectarian, lazy voices confirming things in a room.
But wouldn't it be great if like we could just then create those societies based on those beliefs? Like, all right, well, you're not bothering anyone, let's just.
I never said it was easy. I said it would happen.
And finish us up here, Mr. J, any last thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I am a deep believer in moral progress, for sure. But I think this PT reminded us that every AOK needs to remember history. Like, if any AOK divorces itself from its own history and history in general, that's inevitably going to be problematic. And so, as much as I am a believer in moral progress, and I think 100 years from now, ideally, we're better TOK students and TOK teachers and English teachers and everything, and human beings, more in peaceful coexistence with our technologies. But yeah, if we ever get too, the danger is if we get too satisfied in that, then we stop looking backwards. And I can say this too, because I used to be like one of these token science guys that like didn't care about history, because in science you can kind of get away with that. You're like, oh, the recent evidence, the new theories, that's what matters. That's the correct stuff, or the correcter stuff, than all the previous dead false theories. But that's one of the most dangerous things we can do. So I think this like deeply, you know, kind of conservative attitude ultimately to look backwards and to be patient with that, I think we'll always need to have. Yeah.
Excellent. And we have any people in the audience with some questions? We have
The
about
huge
5 to
audience.
6 minutes. I mean, this giant, oh, you in the back now? Okay. Anyone have any thoughts or questions that you'd like to contribute here? No, stop.
I'm wondering if anyone on the panel can just, it has been mentioned, but just talk more about what does evidence mean in the context of the arts, and what does evidence mean in the context of maths. I think it's more obvious in the other 3 areas of knowledge. Mr. Hemrick gave an interesting example of note-taking in a theatre for evidence for film studies. But most of the time when I think of evidence in literature, I'm thinking of giving evidence for a thesis using quotes, but how can we have more recent evidence? What would that look like in literature?
Anyone? I mean, I think that the primary source is going to be the evidence, and typically the most recent. You can obviously go into, you know, academic or critical reviews of that, you know, text that you're working with, but ultimately I do think that the primary source is the most reliable evidence, and unfortunately that's not always the most recent.
One area with the arts that I did have a chance to bring up, I'm trying to make it real short. I think that technique is a really big place where you can see the notion of evidence, and I've had this experience in my own life with photography. There's a particular type of printing process that is seldom practiced these days, and when I'm looking for information on it, I'm often consulting things from the late 1890s or the 1900s, and it's pretty common for me to find things that are at odds with what I'd say, I guess, is the general consensus of weird practitioners of this alternative photographic process online, right? And so maybe the notion sort of evidence is evidence of technique, right? Evidence of certain techniques. And then I guess the other one would I think inevitably be technological, right? Like, I mean, techniques of extracting, for example, paintings, first draft, so to speak, that were done and then erased, or sort of a new analysis that shows the type of brush stroke in a way that you couldn't have done before. Then technology would be a producer of new evidence. Mathematics, though, is way beyond me.
Yeah, did you ask about math, Mr. Bell? Yeah, I can't help but think about what we were going to mention in the last panel about computer verified proofs in mathematics, which is an increasing trend. And I think the scary thought I'm having right now I think that's the short answer to your question. I think in the not so distant future, recent evidence might mean in an AOK like mathematics, the most recent computer verification of a proof using the most sophisticated and recent programming language and software. However, what's scary about that to me is I think the more sophisticated these computer proofs get, the less likely us humans are to understand them, including the professionals themselves. Because programming the software is often like very different than doing the math itself. So that's quite fascinating in itself. So I would be inclined to answer Mr. Barning's question that way. Like the most recent evidence in mathematics 20 years from now is like, oh yeah, here's the new proof in my computer that gives the stamp of approval for some crazy theorem. However, it's to the extent that it's super strong, it's the same extent that mathematicians themselves don't understand it. They understand the check mark at the end, the computer says yes, but all the steps along the way, I would be deeply, deeply afraid that they wouldn't be able to follow them. So, for anyone who chooses this, I think math is a pretty cool choice for this one, just because of Mr. Barton's question.
Good. And I can say the only thing that we know is inevitable is that we will be continuing these TOK talks next year. It's been a pleasure going through it this year. Well done, panelists. Hooray. Goodbye until next year. We hope you have a wonderful new year full of new thoughts, ideas, and joy.
Thank you.
I think it was one of the best ones.
Yeah? Thanks, Emma. You went to like all of them, Emma.